This is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560. The Answer.
Good morning, Dan and Amy. It's really interesting to me, the divide between the intellectual set and regular people when it comes to this discussion of race relations in America, which statutes should stay, which statutes should go, Antifa and white supremacists. It's really interesting. Let me give you an example. A Dartmouth professor at Dartmouth, was on Meet the Press yesterday with Richard Cohen, who is the head of the Southern Poverty Law Center, which is a left-wing hack shop that just designates people they disagree with as hate groups. Carl Cannon had a piece a few months ago in the Real Clear Politics exposing exactly what the Southern Poverty Law Center is and how it's been legitimized by the D.C. press corps, but it's just an ideological hatchet shop for people they disagree with. Family Research Council, for example, is a hate group, even though they've been the target of hate crimes. And he's the reasonable voice in this discussion between little Chuck Todd and this Professor Bray of Dartmouth, who is seriously advocating for preemptive violence. And Richard Cohen from the Southern Poverty Law Center was violently opposed to it. But listen to the argument that the good professor is making. He's the author of the Antifa Handbook. A very Alinskyite.
You seem to be a very small minority here who is defending the idea of violence, considering that somebody died in Charlottesville. Why do you defend confronting in a violent way?
Well, first, I would contest the notion that I'm that small of a minority. I think that a lot of people recognize that when pushed, self-defense is a legitimate response to white supremacist and neo-Nazi violence. And, we've tried ignoring neo-Nazis in the past. We've seen how that turned out in the 20s and 30s. And the lesson of history is you need to take it with the utmost seriousness before it's too late. We've seen the millions of deaths that have come from not taking it seriously enough. And we can see that really the way that white supremacy grows, the way that neo-Nazism grows is by becoming legitimate, becoming established, becoming everyday, family-friendly, wear khakis instead of hoods. And the way to stop that is what people did in Boston, what people did in Charlottesville. Pull the emergency brake and say, you can't make this normal.
It's Professor Mark Bray of the Ivy League up there in scenic New Hampshire with only his own thoughts, and they're quite frightening. So you want this to metastasize? Family-friendly white supremacists. What the hell is he talking about? But advocating violence. Andrew Young, civil rights leader, also on Meet the Press this weekend, had this to say.
The problem with and the reason I feel uncomfortable condemning the Klan types is they're almost the poorest of the poor. They're the forgotten Americans. And they have been used and abused and neglected.
I feel uncomfortable condemning the white supremacist types, the KK types, because they're the forgotten man. That's essentially saying the forgotten man that Amity Shlaes wrote about. That's who Trump was appealing to. And the forgotten man who's been used and abused, middle-aged, middle-income white people are the Klan. And, not a small group, but that demographic, that profile.
Painting with a broad brush.
I would say. And then you have just a regular American citizen, Candace Owens, who's this YouTube video she posted was going viral over the weekend. Candace Owens is a young African-American female, and she had this to say: see who you think is making the most sense. The Dartmouth professor, the former head of the Southern Christian Leadership Council and civil rights leader, or just little old Candace Owens.
Fact number 1. Approximately 93% of black homicide victims are killed by other black people. In 2014, 6,095 black people were killed, and virtually all of them were killed by other black people. Black Lives Matter protesters may want to consider extending their slogan to "Don't shoot," because we've already got it covered. And you're not special, white people. Seriously, in 2012, 84% of white homicides were committed by other white people. Go figure. It's like we're all racist towards our own selves. Nobody wants us dead more than we want ourselves dead.
It's interesting.
I mean, there are, 6,000 Klansmen left in our nation? You want me to actually process that as a legitimate fear every day when I wake up? It's obviously the media's fault. I mean, the media is creating this entire narrative, and it is crazy, absolutely crazy to me that people have not figured this out yet. I mean, why do you think we didn't hear a single thing about David Duke, white supremacy, and the KKK the entire time Obama was in office?
It's an interesting question. They just popped up because what? Trump has made it okay for them to come out of the shadows? Well, I'm glad that this small group of hateful idiots is out of the shadows because then they can be ridiculed and marginalized as is appropriate. I always like, fighting it out in public rather than in back alleys. It's so much more effective and final.
When you see their faces, they're not just on on social media anymore.
And then just this is the conversation we've had all the time. Your interactions in everyday life, do they resemble at all Charlottesville or, pick a college campus? Or are they more like what Candace Owens had to say?
Maybe it's me. Maybe I live in a bubble where black people and white people actually get along every day. When I went to the gym this morning, a white girl signed me in and handed me a towel. No beef. I was trying to figure out how to use this weight machine, and a black trainer came over and helped me. No drama. I even went to the coffee shop thereafter, and a Spanish girl made my latte with an extra shot. All good in the hood. And it was a great day. So you'll have to forgive me for not realizing that the figurative racial sky was burning, and it was up to me to choose a side. Because if I had known, I obviously would have picked none of you losers. Honestly, everybody involved in this fake racial war is a loser. So please, spare me the statuses, and your white guilt, and your black pride, because I really don't care to see it. You know what's going to happen if we keep down this path? We are actually going to allow the media to create those divisions where none existed prior.
So who's making more sense, Candace Owens or all of the academics and deep thinkers that you see on the Sunday talkies? Well,
I'm going to go with Candace Owens.
I think that's the right answer. Speaking of deep thinkers, but he is a legitimate one, we're pleased to be joined by Noah Rothman for more on these and other related topics. Noah Rothman, associate editor for Commentary Magazine. Noah, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So you've had a lot of people, not just Candace Owens, but several op-eds over the weekend suggesting, Holman Jenkins and others suggesting that this is going to get worse, what we've seen in Charlottesville and to a lesser extent in Boston, what we've seen on college campuses. This extremist show is just starting. Do you agree with that?
Probably. My instinct is to be optimistic in these events, but that's probably a flawed instinct because this isn't like this was a bolt from the blue. We had been dealing with political violence for the better part of a year. I've been writing about it for a better part of a year, and we've just had no appetite for a national conversation about where that violence was coming from, who was conducting it, why it was being conducted. Quite a bit of it was on the left, and it was just indicative of the established media narrative that this was exclusively a Republican problem, a pro-Trump problem, that it just didn't really come up. And now we're dealing with the fruits of that. I find it remarkably terrifying, the extent to which responsible people are afraid of calling violence on all sides a bad thing, as though that takes a lot of courage. Apparently it does, perhaps because their peer sets do not agree. But that's where we're at, and that doesn't end well.
Well, not only just afraid to call violence, regardless of its source, a bad thing, advocating it, like this Dartmouth professor Mark Bray was over the weekend on Meet the Press.
Yeah, I mean, disheartening doesn't begin to describe it. We are failing the memories of our parents, our grandparents, their parents, who did a remarkable job in fashioning a republic in which these kind of disagreements aren't hashed out in the streets. this is identity politics, and identity politics has a violent element to it. It always has. Most of the world, identity politics is just politics. That's not the case here. At least it hasn't been. And I'm not sure whether or not that's going to be the case tomorrow.
Do you feel that President Trump's comments, though, on Charlottesville empowered white nationalists?
Well, it certainly didn't alienate them. And that's not me saying it. That's they're saying it. Now, I'm not sure the extent to which this is not an honest display. Perhaps it is, the wish fathering the thought or posturing for the benefit of the listening audience. But they're saying that, not me. I believe that probably a lot of people listening to that didn't say, the people who wanted these statues to stay, although that was a pretense for this organization, this group meeting. That was not the stated perspective when they got together. That was an after-the-fact retroactive conditioning. But when the president says there are some good people there, they're thinking, well, I'm a good person, and I don't want those statues taken down. And maybe they didn't know the fact that there were a torch-lit rally with people saying Jews will not replace us throwing Hitler salutes. Maybe they just didn't know that. I wouldn't be surprised. So there's quite a bit of people who probably have their own media that they consume that are not aware entirely of the extent to which the president was referring to an event that was irredeemable and redeeming it. That's irresponsible.
Our friend John Cass, who, of course, page 2 columnist for the Chicago Tribune, had an interesting piece over the weekend. This is what happens with amoral men, talking about President Trump. There's a lot of amoral transactional people in politics. And what he writes about Trump is he seemed to be going out of his way not to offend the white boys who voted for him. I don't think this is because he's a racist or that he joins with the neo-Nazis in hating Jews. Of course, his daughter is Jewish, her husband is Jewish. But Trump is by nature a flatterer, a tribal thinker, narcissistic enough to love those who love him. The whites out the rally voted for him, and now the alt-right praises him for his tepid commentary. So this is the personality flaw is not that he's a racist, but that he's a tribal thinker who just returns the love from wherever it comes. What about that idea?
It strikes me as less of a defense and more of an indictment.
No, that's right. Yeah, I mean, that's the flaw, right?
It's certainly not a mark of courage. Yeah, somebody, I forget who said it, but somebody who I follow on Twitter said, Trump isn't a white supremacist, he's a Trump supremacist.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, right.
Whoever happens to be praising him in the moment is who he's with. But that's a display of absolute, outrageous, indefensible cowardice. It's not something that we should be praising or even excusing. It's a dereliction of his responsibility, full stop.
So on Friday, Steve Bannon, we all saw it coming, whether he was forced out or he resigned. That's not the issue. The issue is, how is he going to be affecting the Trump presidency on the outside?
I don't know. My instinct is that he's going to be pursuing what he thinks is helping in the most counterproductive way possible. That the interview that he gave inexplicably to the American Prospect, to a liberal journalist who was adversarial at a publication that has had no love for Steve Bannon's tenure, was quite transparently an effort to derail the administration's strategy on North Korea, which has been to rehabilitate and support and work with China and create the conditions on the outside to pressure the president to adopt a strategy that's more hostile towards China from the outside, while serving as the president's senior advisor. This is sabotage in the extreme, outrageous insubordination. He had to go.
Well,
it demonstrates the extent to which he was already on the outside in the White House. And so I imagine he'll be doing the exact same thing now, only genuinely on the outside.
Well, the New York Times reported that Bannon had a conversation with Kelly more than a month ago, and that his exit was set, and it was going to be more graceful than how it turned out to be because of Charlottesville. But that he had known for at least 4 to 6 weeks that it wasn't a matter of if, but when.
Yeah, I'm not sure what to believe there. Maybe not. That was kind of the story with Reince when he resigned. It was, he resigned a long time ago, and we were going to do this in XYZ way, and it just kind of was haphazard and sloppy. So, after a while, you start beginning to question whether or not these are, attempts at exculpation after the fact rather than a genuine news report.
So all that's left, though, are generals, Wall Street guys, and Trump's family. That's all that's around him from the original group of men that surrounded President Trump.
Well, you've got Stephen Miller, you've got Mike Anton, but yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's getting pretty establishment, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm not sure whether I would say that the brass that's around him is establishmentarian or Republican. They are institutionalists, that's for sure. And I think that's the proper frame for this, is that you have people who are outsiders, who are counter-institutionalists, anti-establishmentarian, and they're defenestrated. For the most part, as you say. There's a couple, Mike Ganta and Steve Miller are among the two most high-profile, but the rest of them are stabilization, anti-insurgency, coalition. You can think of this as the surge in Iraq. I mean, it's an attempt to contain an otherwise an instinct that is otherwise not violent, but aggressive and maybe overreaching, and it's working. I think you'll see tonight when the president talks about Afghanistan and the continuation of the status quo, that it's essentially working.
The Wall Street Journal opined on Bannon's departure on Friday after the Bannon presidency. Is that a bit of an overstatement that the first 8 months were the Bannon presidency? I mean, other than a move on the administrative state and in advance of deregulation, I mean, what are exactly the policy initiatives that have Steve Bannon's mark on it to the exclusion of President Trump or those in the White House? I'm not sure I see them.
Well, I'm not sure you can say that to the exclusion of anything. Nothing happens in the White House to the exclusion of the president. That being said, there were quite a bit of initiatives. Most of them were the disasters. The attempt to impose restrictions on immigration, including visa holders and green card holders. That was a Bannon-Miller initiative. The attempt to isolate sanctuary cities, which has been stopped in the courts. That is an initiative of this group. The continuation of the Keystone Pipeline with the use of American steel, none of which exists, by the way. We didn't have nearly enough steel to make that happen. It was just a desire, and was subsequently struck from this executive order because it was so outlandish and absurd. But in order to isolate China, that was a Steve Bannon initiative. So when you look at these Bannon initiatives, they do have the mark of this wing of the party on them.
Well,
they just happen to be ideological to the extreme.
Well, but I mean, for example, going after sanctuary cities and attaching consequences in terms of funding is an idea that's wildly popular.
But it was pursued as a result of this wing of the party pitching it. It's not as though this is a Republican consensus. It is in the grassroots. It's not in the establishment wing, and because it hit a snag in the courts. It's not as though these things are resented for their own sake. They're not pursuable. They're not implementable without an actual strategy. I'm not sure if this is a reference. It's probably way too young for the audience, definitely for me. But the Steve Bannon wing is the Leroy Jenkins of this group. They reject planning. They reject sort of a sort of centrist, moderate approach, consensus building, establishing a coalition before acting. They act first and want the coalition to follow. And that's why it's been a mess.
He is Noah Rothman, Associate Editor for Commentary Magazine. Noah, thanks as always for joining us. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
This is the morning